All right, so I'd like to introduce Tommaso Guariento, who holds a postdoctoral research position within the ERC AIMODELS project, dedicating himself to the study of the multiple manifestations of collective intelligence, employing an approach ranging from philosophy of mind to complex systems. Yeah?
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So, the title of the presentation is the vector grounding problem between linguistics and economics. And this is the index. We'll cover the vector grounding problem, Rossi-Landi and the homology between economics and linguistics. So Rossi-Landi is an Italian Marxist philosopher, was an Italian Marxist philosopher of language working in the tradition of structural linguistics and Marxian economy. The relation between value and meaning in Saussure, Wittgenstein, Sraffa, and Piero. Model collapse and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and self-reference as a general problem for LLMs, Bayesianism and vector spaces as epistemic images, and theory of meanings and the theory of value. So what is the vector grounding problem? We start with this question. I quote from this paper from Mollo and Millière and Dimitri Mollo. If AI systems are merely designed to process linguistic inputs, how can their outputs be grounded in a world with which they have not direct interaction? The question is obviously an interesting one. And to answer this question, I need to refer to this paper by Emily Bender and an excellent scholar with their thought experiment of the octopus test. So the octopus test is this image. Two English-speaking castaways find themselves stranded on a neighboring island, separated by treacherous water. Fortuitously, they discover telegraphs left by previous inhabitants, connected via an underwater cable, which enables them to communicate by exchanging telegraphic messages. And so there is this octopus that is trying to decipher the message they are sending. The octopus can detect electric signals, but it doesn't process the meaning. Its understanding, much like a large language model, is confined to the probability distribution of signals or tokens. This begs the question, can the octopus truly comprehend the patterns of human communication, or does it merely infer the statistical probabilities of tokens? I believe this thought experiment is closely related to Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of cryptography and communication, developed by Bell Labs in the 40s. In Shannon's model, there are two subjects that communicate using a specific code, and an enemy cryptoanalyst attempts to decode their message. The cryptoanalyst directly parallels the octopus in Bender and Collar test. And another similarity is that Shannon theory views communication solely as a syntactic process. So, Mollo and Millière present 5 notions of grounding. Referential grounding, lexical representation is connected to its worthy referent. Sensory motor grounding, a lexical representation is connected to sensory representations. Relational grounding, lexical representation is connected to the other lexical representation, and communicative grounding. Two speakers calibrate their interpretation of an exchange to make use of the same lexical concept. And epistemic grounding, a lexical representation is connected to information stored in a knowledge base. My core thesis is that communicative grounding is what interests us, or interest me, as AI models, and AI models are inherently unable to achieve it. So Mollo and Millière propose indirect reference coupled with epistemic grounding as a solution to the grounding problem. Their approach suggests that both humans and the AI system can access the meaning of an idea or a word by consulting definition within a database, such as a dictionary or an encyclopedia. Gastaldi offers an alternative solution by advocating for a broader definition of meaning. This perspective is connected to structuralism, to Deleuze's logic of sense, and insight into mathematical practice. One argument supporting my thesis, but this is a sort of an analogy, and all analogies are wrong, but some are wronger. And so I start with this analogy. So this is a model of game theoretical, that model, the game theoretical Turing machines, basically, in this article of Kevin Binmore, feature 2 Turing machines, each attempting to infer the symbols produced by the other. Those symbols represent the machine software instruction encoded using Gödel numbers. The core finding of this model by Wilmore is that these machines cannot simultaneously calculate and predict the other next symbol. This leads to an inherent logical conundrum, which often characterized as I think that you think that I think infinite loop. So this model is not what LLMs are, but is a sort of tentative introduction to the idea that there is a problem with communication and the use of model of Turing machine and artificial intelligence. So I start, however, the central argument of my thesis is require the introduction of Ferruccio Rossi-Landi, homology between linguistics and economics. This foundation is essential for constructing both the social theory of meaning and the social theory of value. My contention is that without communicative grounding, both the theory of meaning and the theory of value become groundless. The very state of groundlessness, in turn, inevitably leads to phenomena of collapse. Rossi-Landi begins by examining the inherent connection between value and meaning, a relation that has deep roots to a history of thought. It takes a starting point, the parallels between Ferdinand de Saussure theory of meaning and the marginalist school of economics. Both frameworks view meaning and value as subjective and differential. Unlike classical theory, where value might be seen as intrinsic substance, the marginalist perspective defines value not by inherent qualities, but by its position within a system of relative preference and scarcity. Similarly, Saussure posited meaning isn't tied to an external referent, but rather emerges in a dual entity of language and parole, constituting to a system of negative differences. However, Rossi-Landi introduces a crucial third term, labor. For him, labor isn't just an economic activity, it's a fundamental human, social, and relational activity. It's through this cooperative process, where two or more individuals exchange artifact and science to achieve the shared goal of transforming nature, that both meaning and value are truly grounded and made social. So Ferruccio Rossi-Landi was an Italian philosopher and semiotician who studied philosophy at University of Milan and Pavia and at Oxford. And basically, he developed this idea of the homology between linguistic production and material production in his seminal work, Linguistics and Economics, and then in Language as a Work and Trade and other books. Rossi-Landi held a position of philosophy lecturer at University in Padova, taught in the US and Havana, and then served as professor of philosophy at Lecce and at Trieste. The diagram of the right side of the slide represents Ferruccio Rossi-Landi homology between linguistic production and material production. The scheme is divided into two columns. It's representing a different type of production, material and linguistic. Within these columns are various layers, it's signifying a different level of complexity. For instance, at the most basic level, we find matteremes at the fundamental units of the material production and phonemes of the basic unit of linguistic production. The core idea is that just as linguistic output results from combining various atomic linguistic entities, material production involves the composition of different artifacts. Interestingly, those two production paths converge again at the 8th level, where we see the concept of the automatic machine alongside the automatic production of language. This latter point, a theme that Rossi-Landi explores in other works, can be directly linked to today's large language models. So in order to construct a social theory of value and meaning, we need to extract three concepts from Rossi-Landi research: fixed linguistic capital, variable linguistic capital, and linguistic labor power. So fixed or constant linguistic capital is inanimate if variable capital is not added to it. In the case of language, the variable capital must be saw in the speakers and identified as the value of the linguistic labor power expanded by them. Linguistic labor power can be defined as the mere capacity, generally understood, to use a language, to speak in it. It qualifies one as belonging to a verbal science system. So linguistic labor power is related to the Marxian notion of living labor like a constant and variable capital. In his seminal work, Language as Work and Trade, Rossi-Landi develops his homology by drawing a confrontation between Ludwig Wittgenstein linguistic theory and the Italian economist Piero Sraffa. The chapter titled Toward a Marxian Use of Wittgenstein highlights the intellectual intersection. Wittgenstein and Sraffa, both working in Cambridge during the early 20th century, engage in a significant discussion on philosophical, ethical, and methodological questions. It's widely acknowledged fact that Sraffa is among the very few living individuals that explicitly are quoted by Wittgenstein. Furthermore, there is a growing body of scholarly work exploring the intricate relation between those two thinkers, particularly concerning their ideas on value and meaning. So Rossi-Landi highlighted significant structural similarities between the Sraffa production of commodities by binary commodities and Wittgenstein philosophical investigation. Both books, according to Rossi-Landi, begins with a relatively simple situation of interaction, a language game in Wittgenstein term, and for Sraffa, a simple model of economic exchange. From those fundamental basic interactions, both works proceeded to develop a more complex structure, such as an economy with various sectors and a more intricate language game. According to Egid Sinha, both Sraffa and Wittgenstein portray communication and economic exchange in a circular and self-referential manner. I quote, "As the world cannot look for support outside the language game in which they are used, commodity values cannot look for support outside the given system of production and distribution." So Rossi-Landi criticized Wittgenstein for the absence of the category of labor within his theory of language games. He argues that the fundamental human interaction where science and commodities are exchanged isn't a mere generic or simple thought experiment. Instead, it originates from the metabolic rift or the working relation between humans and their environment. However, the relation between value and meaning is not fully captured by the reference of the author favored by Rossi-Landi. Similar insight can be found in a more contemporary framework, for example, this Parik linguistic theory, Language and Equilibrium. Parik states that his theory of meaning is developed as a fixed-point solution deriving mathematically from the general economic equilibrium of Harvey-Debreu. I quote, "Conventional meanings are analogous to the price of goods and referential meaning are analogous to the quantities supply and demand." So in this equilibrium theory of meaning, there is a parallel between the economic concept of a fixed point or mathematical concept of fixed point and the establishment of a linguistic fixed point achieved through communicative negotiation between speakers. So building on Rossi-Landi concept of variable and fixed linguistic capital, I try to show how those frameworks can illuminate the failure of current large language models through the lens of Marx's theory of the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall. Within large language models, meaning is constructing from the models itself, from human data and synthetic data. This mirrors Marx's view that value is comprised of constant capital and variable capital. Just as Marx defined the organic composition of capital as the relation between those forms of capital, we can similarly develop an organic composition of data to describe the ratio between synthetic and human data in large language models. And the second formula is the well-known Bayes theorem, which calculates the probability of an hypothesis given observable data. So in order to understand model collapse how to understand model collapse using those formula. So model collapse occurs when large language models are trained on synthetic data rather than fresh human data. And so there is this organic composition of data, and the shift represents in a rising organic composition of data. There is a synthetic data increasing relative to human data. And this parallel marks tendency of the rate of the profit to fall, suggesting an inherent limitation in value creation when constant capital dominates variable capital. In the Bayes theorem, training on more synthetic data means the model gives excessive weight to its own priors, so existing pattern from prior training, and diminish the influence of the new likelihood, so fresh human data. And this leads to a self-reinforcing loop that degrades the model ability to generate truly and novel or grounded content. So the rising in organic composition of data is illustrated in this projection which charts the relationship between human and synthetic data up to 2224. And so we can see that the scarcity presents a fundamental limitation from the continuation advancement of current training paradigms or LLMs. Another way to apply Rossi-Landi Marxian linguistic category is by examining the scheme present in this technical paper towards theoretical understanding of self-consuming generative models. So this is a diagram that represents collapse as a self-consuming loop. There are two data sources, human data and synthetic data, and both types of data are fed into the model for training. Given the self-referential nature of this loop, it becomes clear that with the current technology, it's impossible to generate genuinely new meaning from synthetic data. And so we can map basically the Marxian categories within this model. So human-generated data are living labor, and LLMs are composed by synthetic data, and the model is a machinery. So the theory of Marx explained that the dead labor can only transfer value and not produce new value. So model collapse can be understood as a phenomenon that touches computation, Bayesian epistemology, and economics. So computation refers to the issue related to mathematical limits exemplified by the theorem of Cantor, Gödel, and Turing. And the first article used Cantor diagonal method to argue that the inherent inevitability of hallucination in generative model. The second paper addressed vector grounding problem, highlighted by Bender and Koller, connecting it to an impossibility result derived from Turing theorem. And the third article delved into the nature of LLMs, framing them as a probabilistic Turing machine. And the probabilistic Turing machine used this concept or mathematical theory of Solomon induction that uses Shannon entropy-based theorem and Turing machine, and Solomon induction is uncomputable. So if we understand large language models as a probabilistic machine or probabilistic Turing machine, there are problems with the use of Bayesian formula. So there is a sort of Bayesian collapse. So Bayesian collapse is when, for example, in large language models, the token probability distribution collapses when the large language model collapses. The first two papers says that when a model collapses, it loses the ability to accurately map human speech patterns. That is the normal probability distribution of word in typical human communication. Instead, the probability distribution of its token word phrase is transformed from a normal distribution to a skewed distribution or fat-tail distribution. This is the same phenomenon that can be observed in the probability distribution of human perception using an hallucinatory state when viewed through a Bayesian model of cognition. So in such a state, the human mind gives more weight to priors than to likelihood. And finally, we can use this Bayesian framework to understand collapse in financial markets during turbulent phases. And it's crucial to note that, as with the previous Bayesian model of hallucination, this interpretation refers to a peculiar understanding of the economic system and markets, one specifically founded on the Bayesian epistemology. And so this is another analogy, and this is the most speculative one. So there is this paper, comparison of large language models with aphasia. And its reference here, as the title indicates, of the paper, comparison of large language models with aphasia, because in this paper there is a comparison between speech performance of human subject exhibiting various aphasic impairments with the speech performance of large language models, and they point to a specific kind of aphasia, Wernicke aphasia, that is an aphasia where individuals exhibit fluent speech. Grammatical and syntactical rules are preserved, but there is a peculiar misuse of meaning. So it is as the speaker can produce language without a complete comprehension of the words that they are implying. To summarize, the problem of model collapse or hallucination and vector grounding problem are problem of self-reference. And so we can pinpoint to this problem of self-reference in a sort of more formal way with using category theory. And I quote these two papers, but I not explain because we don't have time. But I explain my idea with this simple syllogism. If there is an homology between meaning and value, and if value and meaning cannot be defined internally because this leads to paradoxes of self-reference, the phenomenological manifestation of which is collapse, then it follows that meaning and value have an external grounding, namely one that is social, relational, and sometimes conflictual. The thesis I want to problematize, it's this alternative syllogism. So if AI generates meaning like organism and the human species, and if the production of meaning is disconnected from intentionality, understanding, and consciousness, then AI, organism, and the human mind produce meaning to a common predicative and Bayesian inferential process. So this is the idea that the mind is a prediction machine, the artificial intelligence is a prediction machine, and the market is a prediction machine. So the mind is a prediction machine. We can find this basic idea or ideology or epistemic image in these frames from a YouTube lesson of this researcher at Google that also work at the Berggruen Institute. And it says, really, I think that we humans basically are next word predictors, and the people are pretty much sequence models. So the biography about Bayesian model of cognition is extensive. I only mention those important works. The most popular one are the work of Andy Clark, but there are more technical works on active inference and the predictive mind. The idea of the market as a prediction machine is a sort of trade union between the concept of a mind as a prediction machine and the market as a prediction machine. We can find this in Friedrich Hayek. I will not attempt to summarize the relation between those neurological research by Hayek and his economic thesis, because this topic has been extensively covered by Matteo Pasquinelli in his book. So I merely point out that the legacy of Hayek lives in recent work at the Santa Fe Institute. And to summarize, Bayesianism, I think that is an epistemic image of artificial intelligence, human psychology, and biology, and political economy. An epistemic image, I quote the definition of Lorraine Dunston, is one that made with the intent of not only to depicting the object of scientific inquiry, but also to replacing it. A successful epistemic image becomes a working object of science, a stand for the too plentiful and too various object of nature, and one that can be shared by a disparate community of naturalists. An epistemic image earns its name by translating abstract epistemology priorities into concrete picture. So I conclude my presentation with two questions. One is this: is meaning physical, human, structural, social? And if social, conflictual? This is my thesis. And we can have a physical theory of meaning, for example. I quote this theory by the physician Carlo Rovelli, and basically Carlo Rovelli, meaning is understood as the correlation between an organism and its environment, expressed in relative information, and when a bacterium identifies a food sources in an environment, it correlates with this element, leading to an increase in survival chances. And same concept, we can find this in the Giorgio Prodi biosemiotic ontology. So meaning for Prodi is an emergent phenomenon that characterizes all physical interaction, chemistry, biology, human life. And with this theory of meaning, just in Rovelli's case, there is no separation between human and artificial and natural orders. And so it's also important to recall the structuralist or neo-structuralist theory of meaning defended by Gastaldi, which we were covered this morning. According to the position, if my understanding is correct, meaning it's conceived as a formal structure with a formal property of a science system. For example, for a meaning, if you use James-Levian semiotics, we have the commutation test, we have the two axes, so there is a meaning is described by these formal properties. And then this is the thesis I want to use. The thesis developed by the Swedish cognitive scientists Peter Gärdenfors and Massimo Warglien. This is a professor of economics and mathematics here in Foscari. I believe that their theory provides an adequate framework for understanding the communicative exchange. Utilize mathematical formalism, for example, fixed point, convex region, and category theory. They conceptualize meaning as a negotiation, a bargain between two or more individuals or groups. In their communicative intention, if their communicative intentions are similar, a fruitful exchange can be achieved. However, and this is the picture that summarizes my thesis, if their conceptual spaces are incompatible, then those negotiations transform into conflict. Much like the scenario depicted in this comic strip, In this image, we see two armies positioned as opposite sides. Their banners, however, feature the classic rabbit-duck illusion, and the reason for the opposition is a direct consequence of their univocal interpretation of the same ambiguous sign. So each army thinks that the illusion is either a rabbit or a duck, and so I quote the Warglien and Gärdenfors, the nature of conceptual preference can be cognitive, for example, the result of the individual preference, or in other cases, it may reflect the value of a specific conceptualization in light of broader utility consideration, for example, the interpretation of a prototypical quality of the object of exchange in a commercial contract, or maybe in a working situation, is subject to obvious conflict of interest between the two transactive parts. So the last part, there is a sort of the same with the question we can apply to the theory of value. We can have a subjective theory of value, an objective theory of value, and a relational and conflictual theory of value. The subjective theory of value is the neoclassical theory of value. There is supply and demand, and there is this interaction between supply and demand. And then the objectivist theory of value, where basically what economists think about the Marxian theory of value. And so my idea is to use another theory of value, a conflictual theory of value developed by this mathematician and economist, Marxian economist, Richard Goodwin, and he has a nonlinear model of class struggle. And basically, this idea is that this model is not using a fixed point attractor, because the fixed point attractor in economy is linked to the economic equilibrium. It uses a cyclical or chaotic model. So the characteristic of the cycles and the chaotic turbulence arise because Goodwin model is fundamentally predicated on the premise of a dialectical structure between two parts of society, capitalist and worker. So the conflict prevents the system from setting into a stable equilibrium, so a fixed point, and leading to this cycle of repetitions. So if meaning and value have a social grounding and the society is constructed by a conflict and negotiation between classes and also between individuals, then it isn't possible to conceive meaning and value as a processual entities, not just as fixed point in equilibrium, but to a complex typology of different semantic or different kind of attractors, like cyclical attractors or chaotic attractors. So the next step in our research group, I think, is to study this kind of dynamics, not with a simple Goodwinian model, but through an historical analysis of various intertwined cycles, so cycle of automation, financial cycle of metrics, and cycle of structure. Thank you for the patient attention.
Alrighty. Are there questions to start? We've got a lot of time, so we can have a long discussion if you'd like. Right here.
Thanks very much for the talk, which covered a huge amount of ground. Right at the beginning, you used a diagram which I thought was going to be a Lewis game, but I think it wasn't. The communication between the two interacting agents. You used it as an example of model collapse.
This one?
Yeah. So it looks. So there are, do you know what I mean by Lewis game?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So, but you're using this as a example where you get collapse rather than a sort of agreement on meaning.
I think that this quotation is not the right model. I present this model of the tutoring machine because it's a game theoretical model. I know Lewis games or Brian Skill's work on the signaling system. Is this the model where you're referring to?
Well, I mean, the idea of Lewis games is a lot earlier than the Baroni work, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's it's a sort of fundamental thing about how communication, I mean, actually doing it in practice is very, very contingent on exactly how you set it up. But yeah, I just wanted to check that I hadn't misunderstood something.
Now, this is a model of, this is not a Lewis game. This is a model of true Turing machine attempt to do a prediction of the next symbol of the other machine, and these symbols are basically their Gödel number. It's a model of to demonstrate the impossibility of the rational agent in Binmore article. But this is not a collapse model. This is only to make a sort of an analogy with the idea that dialogue, it's difficult to formalize. This is basically my point.
Okay, but I mean, you know, a successful Lewis game in a very primitive sense does formalize dialogue. I mean, in a very, very primitive sense, I agree. But anyway, there's one more general question that I wanted to ask. How can anything that exists in the world, be it, you know, an individual or a system or whatever, not be a prediction machine? I mean, things have got to, you know, if things are going to continually survive in the world, they have to predict what's going to happen in some sense. So, in a way, everything is a prediction machine, isn't it?
The methodology I used to construct this systemic analogies, it's founded on historical epistemology. So my interesting point is this an analogy? Because there are the idea of the prediction machine is a sort of computational Darwinism. I think is not Darwin theory if you read Darwin's text. So it's my interest is within the use of the metaphor of the prediction machine, because there are other kind of metaphor to understand, for example, I don't know, the natural selection. So for me, I think that the metaphor has something with the reality, but it's a metaphor. So there are other kind of metaphor, because, for example, Darwin didn't think about prediction machines.
No, but
he talked with Babbage about the Darwinian, the selection, but this is another kind of...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think Darwin had that, necessarily that language, but I mean, when you're talking about, say, research into human speech understanding, I mean, yeah, you know, that all does depend on the idea that humans learn by predicting the next word. And it's very difficult for me to see how that is not actually it's more than a metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, it's more than a metaphor.
It's a fundamental idea of modeling how something is going to be capable of existing in the world, isn't it? Anyway, sorry, I'm talking too much.
I would just like to, you know, sort of say, we all have opinions about the sort of ontological nature of the universe, and they're not all the same. So let's just go to the next question if we can. Yeah, over here.
Yes, it's somewhat related, so I was like, I'm sorry, but I'm skipping the line a bit, because my question was also on kind of the notion of predictability and the relationship in the triad that you are mentioning, right? Because I just heard you saying it's a metaphor, and you just heard you saying it's parallel, right? And of course, you know, me coming from a different prediction machine, which is the plan, I'm like, oh, what would happen to your triad if I would replace the market by the plan? Would you have some sort of genealogical relation, right? Because, of course, in my materials, I see not the mind as a site of intelligence, but the collective, right? And so how does that, but the predictability is still there, right? We're obsessed with prediction. And there is like very, very good work being done on that and kind of sociology of Soviet science. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how to to answer. No, I was always thinking that the idea of prediction is basically the problem is how to intend prediction. What I was saying is that this specific kind of Bayesian prediction is a kind of model that not all system of prediction are Bayesian.
Thanks. I wanted to come back to the idea of model collapse. And I was always intrigued by all these papers kind of treating synthetic data as if it was completely remote from human data. And especially as somebody who works on the aspect of labor, right? There's all that human labor of prompting going in the creation of that data, even like with very sophisticated methods. So how does that sort of challenge all the assumption about a model collapse, because it's all purely synthetic?
Yeah, this is what they say about. Basically, I copied their model and then I use the Marxian category, but I know this thing that there are no synthetic data. There are no really synthetic data. But the Marxian question I was saying is that fact that there is this analogy between value and meaning in different authors. And so the idea, the Marxian idea of value is different from, I don't know, the classical idea of value. And this kind of idea that large language models are an autonomous machine, so they are presented in some ideological discourse as that they are working without human interaction. So this idea is that even if we use their model with synthetic data, they are marked as synthetic data, completely synthetic, there is a problem with the model. So I know that when they say synthetic data is not synthetic at all.
Is Fabian in the back?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tommaso. That was great. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I want to ask you about model collapse as well, and I want to ask you about how do you see this unfolding? Because I'm very sympathetic to the analogy, and it makes a lot of sense to me. But at the same time, right, the medium in which the collapse of capitalism is to unfold in Marx is history, and in a sense, that same medium, it is the same medium for models, right? So we should look at the development and the collapse of models across history, looking at history. But if we do so, and if we don't assume some sort of sterile experimental condition where we have one model and we feed it infinite synthetic data and eventually collapses, right? Then things change because they're not monadic at all anymore, and they actually interact with each other. There's holes in that whole thing, right? So in what sense can we claim that model collapse is analogous to the kind of collapse in Marx, right? If the same constraints apply, wouldn't we think that then eventually the same consequences apply also, which is that capitalism obviously hasn't collapsed?
Yeah,
and all of neo-Marxism, right, has tried to explain why. So what is the neo-Marxist kind of like version of that model collapse explanation?
Yeah, I have one slide, but I raised it. It was a slide on the counter tendencies, because there is clearly, we can use, we cannot use Marx terminology, but we can use a social analogy of a social analysis of the, for example, idea of accumulating more data or using data from other kind of, not Wikipedia, but from Reddit. So clearly, the idea of the Marxian formula, we discussed this formula with Matteo, is not a formula, it's a sort of dialectical between capital and labor. So there is not a collapse. Basically, it's a sort of cycle of automation, class struggle. So this is, I think, the thing that we are trying to elaborate. It's not a collapse, it's a dialectical relation between different tendencies. The tendency of the model, of the people that are working with this model, is basically to automate a lot of work. And then there is counter tendencies. This is my interpretation. I don't think that I don't know, the Turing impossibility or Gödelian impossibilities are sort of theoretical impossibility of the model and then the model collapse. I think that there are theoretical interesting points, and then there are a sort of dynamical relation of the model and the society.
Yeah, just a super quick response to that. I mean, my question was also partially motivated by your analysis of self-referentiality, right? And the mentioning of like Cantor and people like that, where we're operating at the limits of computability, and I don't think that's the right framework to describe what is happening in these probabilistic systems, but we could talk about more of this.
Okay.
Thanks.
Is there another set of questions? Okay, yeah, right here.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I would like to come back to this question of predictability, more like thinking out loud, and because I feel like I'm on your side, but I'm not sure that you would count this as being on your side. So I'm going to offer to you some way of interpreting the things that have been discussed, that you tell me if this makes sense or not, if it's yet the third position or actually is the same. Which is like, it is true that from a formal point of view, any model can be rephrased or reformulated as a predictive model. That's a formal result, right? But then that doesn't mean that it's equivalent with respect to the effects that a model has in its social context. And let me bring an example here. So when Chomsky argues for his context-free grammars or for his computational devices, the whole point is that you can have a finite device that allows for an infinite set. And that allows for freedom. That explains why humans are free, in a sense that not predictable, because the set is infinite with a finite set. Now, formally, you can reformulate CFGs, like context-free grammars, as predictive models. But now you have a different image of what a human is. Someone who is predictable, which is almost the opposite, right, than being free. And so the effects are not the same, even though the formal connection between models shows you that there's an equivalence. So are you pointing to, I mean, you were talking about metaphors and analogies and all that, but would this be something that you have in mind, that the effects, even though from a formal point of view things might be equivalent, their effect, the images that they put in society have effects that are not equivalent?
But there is an interesting relation between what you are saying about generative grammar and one Italian political philosopher, this Paolo Virno, work about this idea of the generative grammar and the concept of freedom. So I think that, yeah, there is this problem of the relation that we discuss about the use of model, the formal idea of the model. And what I was saying about Bayesian models is that I found that when I read a biology book that use Bayesian models, and I study the history of biology, for example, there are different metaphors. This is my only point. And the idea, for me, the quotation of Duston is what interests me, because Duston speaks about epistemic images that are replaced for something that is more complex. So basically, all metaphors are wrong. But when we study with this historical materialist or epistemological history, the importance is the difference between the metaphors. All the metaphors are not wrong. The metaphors are changing. This is one of the reasons why I think the first works on historical epistemology was basically Ludwig Fleck studying how the manuals of biology were treating the same topic. You read a manual from a century, then you read the other manual. There are completely different metaphors. Clearly, the phenomenon is the same, but we are interested also in this kind of a presentation. So my idea is, yeah, we need a formal part and also a sort of critical part. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's just a technical question, or I may be misunderstanding. When you're referring to synthetic data and the way the discussion's gone on in the room, My understanding of synthetic data is where it's about building out new data sets for data that's considered to be missing. So at the Alan Turing Institute, for example, there's a lot of work done in relation to healthcare to build data sets that are considered, to represent, say, ethnic minorities who are not represented in the data set. And I just wondered, because when we're talking about the large language model generating data, sort of self-generating, as it were, or through the labor of people's prompting, yeah, that creates a lot of problems because you're not getting variety. It's kind of averaging, and that's where I see the collapse. But what's your view about if we understand synthetic data as actually creating data for what data that's considered to be missing? Do you see that as some sort of ameliorative effect to some of the worries you've got?
But the problem is that the analogy with Marx is really, really a crude one. This is the problem. The problem is that another problem that we discuss is the idea that Marx divided human labor and machinery, and this is a dichotomic division. And when we try to understand this problem of for example, model collapse, there is the problem that the worker are the work itself there is some kind of problem with the idea that is not part of machinery. So there is this problem that Marx used a formula that distinguish human and not human. But now, if you do research on, for example, data labeling or task work, there is this problem to identify with Marxian category. Maybe we need to overcome those categories, but we can think with them. The idea of dead labor and living labor, because the problem is with Rossi-Landi, for example, is the theory of dead labor, living labor, and he used the same with language. It's clearly yeah, it's a parallelism. It's not. We can work it out. The only thing I was trying to do is there is this problem of model collapse. This is a problem of data production, and also this is a sort of Bayesian problem. So there is this kind of thing, but our categories maybe we need to change a little bit. But this is a sort of a work in progress.
That's great. Any more questions in the room? No? All right, if not, give a round of applause.
Thanks.